I believe our country and some other countries, England included, have a very interesting legal system that makes life very, very stressful for many, many people. In fact, I believe it makes many of us these days very skittish. We're never knowing when the axe might fall upon us legally. And as a result, especially those in the middle class and above, tend to live life on a need-to-know basis as far as giving information to anyone else of any sort. I can tell you, I see that firsthand. I work and live in a working-class neighborhood, and I see the difference when I do caretaking of somebody who lives in a middle-class area. I can tell you that the people economically on the bottom hide nothing. Maybe they can't manage not to sometimes, but that's their personality style in general. Whereas on the other hand, you don't know anything these days about people in the middle class. I'd like to explore some of that and more. Now, there are a variety of people. Brene Brown, here in this country, says she's doing research on shame. Also in England, Alain de Botton, he may be a Frenchman living in England who started the School of Life and has a lot of great videos. He too talks of this concept of, and Dr. Gottlieb, a third person, she may be German, talking about on YouTube and so on relationships. They all talk of how important it is for others to know who you are if you want connection. Otherwise, you're going to be very lonely, it's said. How can people know who you are if you have a facade and then everything else is on a need-to-know basis? I know I've seen several instances and been doing some recordings lately of, like, say, in movies or other, people saying, well, I can't afford to go on record. Robert Downey Jr. once was on a show, and he was called to task for something in his past as per his views in the past. Also in the movie Notting Hill, Julia Roberts was portraying a character who was very concerned about photographs of someone she was staying overnight with, Hugh Grant. When paparazzi took a picture of him in his underwear when he answered the door in the morning after she was staying there at his place. And she said, this stuff can be brought up forever. It's in print forever. And he was not concerned, but she certainly was as a, quote, celebrity, as portrayed in the movie. Of course, too, you might say people with the most to lose are going to be the most cautious. So those with few economic advantages as per earning power and possessions, you could say have less to lose. And the middle class often and above have much more sunk costs and property holdings. The middle class also is much more tied to their reputation, such that if anyone besmirches their reputation, they will get on the stick to file libel and slander charges. They have the money to do so in court, as opposed to those on the bottom, so to speak, economically and otherwise. Lawyer power being everything in many instances. So, for instance, a week ago, I watched a video by Grant Cardone, who has more than $2 billion in holdings now from high-end real estate, automobile sales, high-end automobiles, and many, many lectures. I call them stadium appearances where he leads massively large crowds. And he has said that he considers a couple of the greatest advantages of money to have time spent in a resort in Mexico and to have great lawyer power. I can also tell you I have a neighbor who had a very difficult marriage, and Her pride and joy, she told me a month ago, was being able to get out of it because she got a better lawyer than her husband. And he was very peeved at how she came up with the money to obtain a better lawyer than he got. Also, it may be common knowledge to many that O.J. Simpson arguably beat a rap the first time around as per murder by getting the best lawyer in town or the country, arguably. And even Dominic Dunn was very peeved when his 22-year-old or so daughter was strangled to death on a date. And then the man involved seemingly got off almost scot-free, and he used a very derogatory term, whores of the court, having helped accomplish this. And then Dominic Dunn's pride and joy as to the outcome, if you could say it at all, was to take the judge to the cleaners and basically reduce him to dog catcher status. Not that I advocate revenge, but that was the point of view and the derogatory terms used by him in general on the situation. He was very troubled. I know, too, I've read before, as per so-called terminology, white-collar crimes, that some have said, well, such individuals get but a slap on the wrist. And then the article was saying that it can be very injurious for a judge simply to render something that causes a troubled nature as to loss of reputation and all the impact then, which was not mentioned, but loss of reputation. And again, how so many defend this in a court of law if they have the money to. If you lose your reputation, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You're going to have economic troubles, of course. Your wife may well bail on you and then want child support and alimony, or vice versa even. You will probably have to shift into the lower class, so to speak, lower class, the money-based poverty class and the associated living conditions. And you may well be lucky to become a dog catcher, proverbially, or bag groceries the rest of your life. You may well be on disability, especially if you're bummed out and go to your local help shop, you get a diagnosis of something or another, depression. That's the generally accepted diagnosis for so much these days, and get yourself tranquilized, basically, one way or another. And then the stigmas associated with all of that, too. But you'll get stigmatized every which way, then, if you come out on the losing end in court. And you will have a very difficult time. Not to mention that if you can't out-lawyer something or out-argue something or be your best advocate, whatever, you will go to prison for an indeterminate period of time. And that's if you're lucky to go straight to prison. You may be in a detention center just held without proof of charge for like 6 months. And there are videos on how people in such situations hang themselves within 48 hours, in fact. Lawyer power having so much to do with how a divorce turns out. Even William Shatner of Star Trek, after 3 seasons with Star Trek, faced a divorce from his wife, and he was so cleaned out, so to speak, that he had to live in a truck with a camper top in the desert surrounding L.A. and do birthday parties on the weekends to make money. And then he had a big comeback. Boston Legal, 911, and, of course, the Star Trek movies. And there was Bob Wells of Cheap RV Living, who has quite a movement going now out west. After divorce, he couldn't afford to live up there in Alaska with child support and alimony, I believe, also. And he bought a $1,500 box truck and lived in it, 6 years, with 2 heaters going in the winter and no windows in it, before he was piecing his life together after many years working the night shift at Safeway stocking shelves. I dare say he had much lawyer power because he didn't have much money left over from stocking the shelves at minimum wage, basically. And everyone else in general not knowing just how things are going to turn out or not in court, regardless of how much money you have. People always saying, well, you get what you pay for, but even then, there are people who can figure out sometimes that the best way to get top dollar, for a while anyway, is simply to charge top dollar. And many will think, well, they must be the best, they charge top dollar. So for instance, too, 40 years ago, someone was working for me, and I went to my boss once and said, this person is really lying a lot to me. And their response to me was, lying is a very serious charge. And so it was dropped right there. Lying, a serious charge as per the consequences. Say, too, as per the psychiatric diagnosis of what they call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a psychiatrist in the United States today who maintains that this is almost never handed out as a diagnosis, except if you've come back from a battlefield. I'd say it's pretty obvious to me, more and more these days, that for anyone to render someone else as suffering from PTSD other than the battlefield will raise a lot of questions as to how it happened and the legal ramifications. So, in fact, I know somebody who suffered molestation for years. And her stepfather once told me, how can I spend time with someone so mentally ill? Her living with him at the time, and he never saw anyone quote for help. And her diagnosis was what? Bipolar and this and that, depression probably, but never, ever did she get a diagnosis of PTSD as per what happened from her stepfather, because the consequences would be so severe to him. And same for many a husband or wife. If it is rendered in a court of law or by a psychiatrist or both, that they are not suffering basically from depression, but PTSD to their spouse. Oh my goodness. Now, children, on the other hand, also not having lawyer power earlier in life, typically, and then statute of limitations running out by generally age 21, I believe, as per filing charges in a court of law against a parent. In my opinion, I could back this up a lot, tend to get termed everything under the sun from the psychiatrist except PTSD as relating to their parent. And even if then, the statute of limitations has run out in just a few short years after 18. So the whole point would be moot. And the parents would fight back with a libel and slander case / defamation. There's even a Dr. Ford, Charles Ford, who wrote a book on lies, and at one point in the book said he knows a man who was 80 years old who was afraid of getting a knock on the door someday from the police saying, you're under arrest for charges from your child of child abuse. I do not tend to use the word child abuse anymore, even though I've written of it with that term in the past and published, because I don't believe really in the term child abuse. For if a parent had a toxic parent in turn, how can you hold them responsible as per an eye for an eye, other than prison sentence or whatever form of meting out some kind of judgment to prevent this from happening again? There's a term for that. Can't get it off the top of my head. But I am not into revenge. And the verse in the Bible that says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I just don't go for the vengeance and retribution and revenge bit. I believe we are all doing the best we can, and unfortunately that sometimes doesn't turn out too well. And there is some kind of need at the same time for a jurisprudence system, courts of law, etc., to say there will be some kind of penalties for what you do even if you couldn't help it, basically. You didn't choose it. But what are the penalties? That's the good question. Because we say, don't we, that the punishment must fit the crime. But I would say that's almost entirely dependent on vagaries of the judge involved, the lawyer you hire, and how much you pay for the lawyer. I would add right here as to something just business-wise, that when Starbucks wanted to wrest control from many a mom-and-pop coffee shop, they hired Bill Gates Sr., a billionaire lawyer, to head up the cause for Starbucks in every which way, marketing, who knows what, and then they catapulted into first place, and many mom-and-pop coffee shops not. Case closed. In that case, Top Dollar bought the best lawyer for business purposes. As you might say, O.J. Simpson bought the best lawyer in town or the country for his purposes, even though some would say it's not an airtight case. Getting back to so-called child abuse, well, after age 21 or so, I've read, this is not prosecutable in a court of law, and I would say it's counter-prosecutable. The child would get a charge of libel and slander, typically, and they wouldn't have the money often to fight this. In fact, there's a book by someone who suffered sexual abuse massively by a father who was very powerful politically or financially or both, and she wrote a memoir about it, amongst other books she wrote, but it may have come out only after his death because he had too much lawyer power to file libel and slander charges against her, basically, if she spoke up before he died. Of course, the consequences to him would be draconian. See, again, the crime, the punishment not fitting the crime. And unfortunately, in my opinion, this in part due to some phrases like, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime, no matter what the time is, so to speak, the punishment. And everybody knows, I think, that the prisons these days in America overcrowded and toxic as per rapes and troubling circumstances from guards and being drugged up typically and working for free, basically, there in the prisons. And having to pay for even your medical care there is something that's very problematic. You come out, you will be expected to take your, quote, meds the rest of your life. I think the state of Virginia, in fact, streamlined that so much that within a week of coming out of prison there's an outlet within a block of you, typically, where you just show up, sign your name, and you got these drugs coming to you for life, zone-out drugs. So it's little surprise to me that we tend to love to accumulate a lot of money, if you would say, oh, you're smart enough to, not just for old age concerns, lest you end up in a, quote, nursing home or Alzheimer's home, as they call it, but also for lawyer power. Even lawyer power in the sense of fighting off a libel and slander charge for something you had something significant as to a role to play, but you don't want to get, quote, your hand lopped off, or your head lopped off, basically, as in a guillotine, so to speak. I did allude to how the prisons are just full of people who have suffered drug offenses. It's a huge money-making industry, too. For instance, I read a book or more by Michael Santos, who spent at least 26 years in prison for selling cocaine when he was about 20. And there was much gang activity. He spent time in maximum security prisons, and who knows what else. And then the challenge of rebuilding his reputation when he got out is being basically the functioning of a scapegoat then. Now, also, a year ago, I listened to an hour-and-a-half-long lecture that was shown on YouTube featuring a panel of people, including Germaine Greer in England, who in her older years now especially, is quite vocal about women's rights or women's concerns. And at one point she said that in England, if you are accused of marital rape, and she was giving examples of a friend she knew, you will spend a minimum of 6 years in prison. And she said that there are so many instances of questionality about what that is, first of all. It being in the eye of the beholder, you might say, but she said it's rather commonplace that maybe a husband might be very encouraging of his spouse to have intimate relations one night, and if the woman were inclined, she could file charges of marital rape, and if convicted in a court of law, 6 years sentence minimum. Let alone that's if in there for good behavior. If you sass off, so to speak, to a guard or get in a fight, I suppose your sentence will be doubled or tripled in time. You'll probably die in there. It's not to mention when you come out, no one says that the stress involved is going to shorten your lifespan considerably, and you will tend to be forcibly drugged the rest of your life or take something or another up on your own, maybe even alcoholism to cope with everything involved afterward, including the stigmas. Yes, bad housing the rest of your life, very limited spouse choices, and your spouse will probably have left you, and you may have a hefty bill on top. And you will have bottom barrel medical treatment. If you get insurance, few people realize that many insurance policies don't pay that much at all. Medicare, Medicaid also, for that matter. Great doctoring doesn't grow on trees. That's why Ben Carson, who was once one of the most gifted brain surgeons, that too does not grow on trees. So good luck hiring Ben Carson if you have Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. He did not do surgery even at the Mayo Clinic. I can guarantee you that. You will get an interesting situation as per any, quote, nursing home or rehab home or what have you. I have a relative once whom I visited daily back 5 years ago. She could only afford a 35-day stay for bowel problems in what I found 2 years afterward was a one-star facility in which she had to share a bathroom with a male who came in once while she was on the facility there. Her shoes were stolen the first day, and she didn't get new shoes for 2 weeks, and she was repeatedly pilloried for not having shoes and walking around in her stocking feet. She had no lock on a locker to keep her stuff in general, and on and on and on. Not to mention that most all people there have roommates who are coughing and have pneumonia and some such. And of course, she got pneumonia within 1 week of being there. And I am amazed she got out of there alive. And to top it off, within 1 week, she lost her will to live, to put it mildly, and stopped eating. And I had to spoon feed the person to keep her alive and demand breathing treatments, so many times for the pneumonia. In turn, then, is what no money will get you, not just for no money for lawyer power, but also if you come out of the clink, so to speak, and don't have much money for anything in old age. So I've been thinking sometimes that maybe we shouldn't label our prisons correctional facilities, or even, as one is close by here, a training center, which, by the way, the prisoners burnt to the ground over food issues and whatnot there some years ago. Thought, why not call them gulags or concentration camps? I mean, everyone knows they're very overcrowded and rape is rampant. In fact, there's even a prison guard who's on record in an article on the internet for having said the guards permit rapes to keep down the prison population, especially in the winter, so the so-called homeless don't flock there even more, because In the homeless shelters, typically you get kicked out in the daytime in the winter and this and that. People prefer prisons. In fact, many in the homeless shelters who get kicked out in the daytime are in fact picked up for vagrancy and this and that, or just by a scared shop owner or customer nearby and processed into prison as part 2 of the homeless shelter complex. I call it now maybe the homeless shelter prison industrial complex. Isn't this then maybe a very unstated reason why so many children today are diagnosed with ADHD, as they call it, or childhood bipolar, or bipolar spectrum disorder, or soft bipolar, or opposition defiance disorder, or autism, or who knows what, rather than the parents getting a rap before statute of limitations run out, and they go to prison and experience everything I'm talking about. Yes, I would not want to use the prison much anymore. That's kind of a noxious term. Would we even say some of the concentration camps throughout history in Europe and Asia were simply prisons? We call them concentration camps for a reason. Or even Indians, Native American Indians in America, who say the reservations they were forced onto have been so undesirable, the last most desirable land in the country, that they call them concentration camps also, not reservations. I used to be thinking lately, why not call such situations where if you get punished for who knows what, it's equivalent to having your hand chopped off, basically, as a minimum. I mean, we only think, oh, that only happens in Muslim countries or something or another. And then this morning I looked online, and woe and behold, they have a word for this. I was amazed. The word being Hudud. Hudud. H-U-D-O-D. H-U-D-O-D, I believe. It's even on Wikipedia as an article. I don't want to read too much by quote, but the article H-U-D-U-D, Hudud, in Wikipedia today says that this is, in the religion of Islam, referring to punishments that under Islamic law are mandated and fixed by God as per Islam. It says that these punishments were applied in pre-modern Islam, and their use in some modern states has been a source of controversy. It says, furthermore, Hudud punishments range from public lashing to publicly stoning to death, amputation of hands, and crucifixion. Hudud crimes cannot be pardoned by the victim or by the state, and the punishments must be carried out in public. These punishments were rarely implemented in practice, however, because the evidentiary standards were often impossibly high. And it goes on to say that based on a hadith, jurists stipulated that Hudud punishments should be averted by the slightest doubts or ambiguities. And further, the Islamic revival of the late 20th century brought along calls by Islamist movements for full implementation of Sharia. Reinstatement of Hudud punishments has had particular symbolic importance for these groups because of their Quranic origin. And their advocates have often disregarded the stringent traditional restrictions on their application. In practice, in the countries where Hudud have been incorporated into the legal code under Islamist pressure, they have often been used sparingly or not at all. Their application has varied depending on local political climate. Their use has been a subject of criticism and debate. And later it says here, in the 21st century, Hudud, including amputation of limbs, is part of the legal systems of Brunei, Iran, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. I'm just going to close with a question then, or two. I find it interesting it being said euphemistically and more, if you can't do the time or in other words, the quote punishment, don't do the crime. But wouldn't that be a slap in the face in some of these countries I just mentioned? In Brunei, Iran, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen, if it was told to people there who were going to have a hand chopped off, or who knows what more, that, well, you should have known better. You deserve it because you chose to do this. So, don't expect not to have your hand chopped off if you chose to do the crime. I'd say if we went to prisons in America today, I don't like using the word prison. That's such a light term. Yeah, I'd rather have my hand chopped off and get out of there. I'd rather be executed, in fact, than to have to sit there and rot for years, and I mean even decades. And that's why people go there and sometimes hang themselves within 24 hours or 48 hours. Maybe coming out, forcibly drugged, typically stigmatized for life, and having horrible prospects for marriage and old age care in general, medical care in general. I think it'd be better to have your hand lopped off in one of these Middle East countries than our system of jurisprudence, frankly. I mean, if all you lose is a hand, that's one thing, but everything I'm talking about that's typical for the, quote, ex-con coming out, oh my gosh, that's like basically being, I don't even have a word for that, my goodness. So no wonder everyone's running around like a chicken with their heads cut off in our country today and saying, like a comedian, S.L. Sears, S.L. Sears, that our rights are being taken away more and more. That in many cases is a bone not of contention, but what are we talking about by rights? I think in part it's exactly what I've been discussing here for the past half hour. We are supposed to be in a law of the land where the punishment meets the crime. But we don't discuss whether the punishment happens to someone because they, quote, chose something, or life just handed them a certain set of circumstances that rendered this. And then what is the punishment anyway? Or even the application of pain, so to speak, so that everyone else knows, don't do that again. This is just part and parcel of I think, then, whether we're going to say, are we advancing or regressing or staying the same? And there was even the Middle Ages, where there was no progress for a while in the Middle East. And a book written by somebody civilized to death. I think his last name was Christopher, or first name Christopher, last name Ryan, R-Y-A-N, a psychologist with a PhD, having written this book, Civilized to Death. Very interesting concept in many ways. I'll just leave this then at that. A lot to process. These are my thoughts and experiences now as someone 61 and who lives in a working class environment, totally, and lives in an apartment complex with many people who have struggled with all of these issues. I know so many facts and figures, it's not funny. So I'm not talking spuriously here. And that's about it for now.